What's going on, guys? So in today's video we're going to be going over how you can use Apollo client in a Next.js and TypeScript project. We're going to be following along the example that Versal wrote in their Next.js repository, and I think that their solution is very elegant, and it shows us that how we can use Apollo client to share data between the client and the server. So of course I'll be leaving the link to this repository in the description so you can have it as a reference. So the first thing that we're going to do is actually head over to their Apollo client file, and we're going to copy over all this code. Now, if I were to write this code all myself in this video, we'd be here for a very long time. So I'm just going to create a file called Apollo client.ts, and I'm going to paste in all the code. Then we're going to have to install a couple of dependencies. So first of all, we need to add Apollo client to our project, as well as Lodash and deep merge. We're also going to need to install the dev dependencies of @types for Lodash so we can have it be usable for TypeScript. So now we just need to fix all of this up and add the types in this file. So this right here. And by the way, I'll explain what all of this code does later, because if I were to explain it now, it wouldn't make much sense. It will make a lot more sense once you start seeing how this is used and what it's for, and then I'll explain it to you more in depth. But for now, we just need to add this type here, and this is going to be a type Apollo client, and you pass it in the normalized cache object, and it could be null because it initializes to null. This link here, we'll change it to http localhost 3000 /API/GraphQL. This can stay like that. We're gonna get rid of this right here and just have it like that. This is gonna stay the same, and this will be type of any. Over here, this will be the same type as we did above, so I'm just gonna copy it over and paste it in here. And then page props is an object that has props, which is any. So we can get rid of this check. And here, this is any. Okay. So for now, let's just focus on this function here that creates an instance of our Apollo client. Here we see SSR mode is set to true if we're in the server and false if we're not. But here we have a link. A link, like the HTTP link, is going to make our request know its destination, and it's going to send it over to this link right here. This is a required link when you're connecting over the network through HTTP. However, when we're doing server-side rendering, and we're going to do a query on our own GraphQL API, which is hosted on the same server as our Next.js project, we do not need to connect over the network. We can actually save ourselves the network delay by connecting directly to our schema instead of through HTTP. So that's exactly what we're going to configure now. So I'm going to create a function called create isomorphic link. And then here we'll do if type of window is undefined. So basically, if we're on the server, this will be true. And if we're on the server, we're gonna have to do a couple of things. So we're gonna, instead of HTTP link, we're gonna use a schema link, which will connect to our schema directly. However, we cannot import schema link into the top level of our file because this code, these imports are ran on the client and the server, because this file is going to be run on the client and on the server. And when we try to import our schema and the schema link, it's going to be running only code that can work on the server. At least that's in the case when you're using Nexus. So to fix that, we can just do here is import our schema inline using requires. So we can do require. We just head over to our modules, and I think I spelled that wrong, so it's require. Head over to modules, GraphQL schema, and then we can do const schema link is equal to require at Apollo client /link/schema. Then we would want to return a new schema link, and it takes in our schema. Now at the moment, since we're using the require syntax, this doesn't have any type annotations, so we don't really know what to do here. Now you could head over to your browser and go to documentation. What I like to do is I like to just import schema link temporarily here. So like that, and then use it. And then here we'll get autocomplete. And we see we pass in a schema, we can pass in a context. Now you might be wondering, why do I need a context if my server over here already has a context? The problem is that we're not connecting to the server, we're connecting to the schema. So really we don't have a context. So we really need to set our context again. Now in our context, if you notice, we have the request object. We would still want access to that. So we're going to be using Apollo client when we're doing server-side rendering. And Next.js gives us that request object, but we're going to have to get it from the function get server-side props. So I'm going to edit these functions so then we can actually have access to the request object in our context. So here I'm going to get the context so I can get the type, which is this. So now I'm going to make a type called schema context, and this is just going to be equal to that. So then here, when we're calling initialize Apollo, we can change this to, instead of just taking an initial state, it takes in an interface that's called init Apollo. And then yeah, it'll hold the same initial state, which is any. But it will also hold context, which is a type of, forgot what I called it, schema context. Okay, so here we can do is wrap this like that. And then we just declare that this is a type of init Apollo, like so. And then this context could be optional, as well as the initial state, because we had it initialized to null, so it's an optional field. So this context, we want to pass it into this when we create our client. So we just pass it in here. So I'm just going to pass in the object like so, with just the context. And I can do that or null. And so now we have to change this function to take in that context as an optional argument. And we can have this set to schema context type. So now over here in our link, we can comment this out. And our link is actually going to be equal to create isomorphic link, and we pass in our context or undefined. And so up here, we want to say that we take in a context or undefined. And so when we're on the server, we're in this block, we do if not a context, then we throw a new error saying context not passed in. Okay, so then that assures us that if we're using Apollo client on the server for server-side rendering, we need to pass in a context, and it's required. Okay, so now I can uncomment this and get rid of this import here because it's not going to work. And then here it will just be what was passed in the entire time. And it looks like we do need to import schema link. We actually do need to import schema link, so I'll import that here. But the important thing is that we cannot import our schema, because that for sure will not work. But schema link might just work. And we'll test it out later. We'll see if it works. Okay, so here, everything should be working fine for the server. So when we're on the client, we're just going to do return from. and then this takes in an array of links. So our first link will be a const HTTP link is equal to a new HTTP link. And then let me uncomment this, and let me just copy everything from here. Oops, what am I doing? And then I can get rid of these lines here. And then I just pass in that link there. So I'm doing this from thing because what this does is it takes multiple links and it lets you assign multiple links to your Apollo context. And we're going to use that later in this series. It's going to be very useful. This is giving me an error because this function here, I just passed in undefined then. Okay. All right, so now we have this link that we're making, and it's different if we're on the server or the client. And we're connecting to our schema if we're on the server, and we're connecting over the internet to our API if we're on the client. So that's exactly what we wanted to do. Now I know I'm skipping over a lot of the code. Don't worry, I'll explain it now. We just need to do a couple of more things. And before we do so, we actually need to fix something. So here in Initialize Apollo, we need to pass in this as an object. So initial state would be state. So we need to pass it in like that. Now we're ready to provide our Apollo client to all of our components in our application. So on the client side. So I'm going to go to our pages into this file right here, _app. And I'm just going to render in Apollo provider. And this is going to let us use Apollo client in the entirety of our application. And so here we would do const Apollo client is equal to use Apollo. And then pass in our page props. I'll explain to you why we're passing in our page props. Okay, so now we have access to Apollo client in our application. So let's start using it. I'm going to go here in our index.tsx. I'm going to show you exactly what we just did and how this helps us use Apollo client for server-side rendering. So I'm just going to do export const get server-side props. This will be an async function like so. And so here, I know we have access to the request, but we're not getting any type annotation. So I need to go here and call this a next or a server-side get server-side props context. Okay, so here we would do const Apollo client. So we're initializing Apollo client equals initialize Apollo. This takes in an object context. We'll just pass in a request into there. And also, since in our resolvers we're using Prisma, we also want to pass in Prisma. So we're going to have to import Prisma. And we'll make sure we're importing our instance of Prisma, which is this one here. So now we're passing to our context request and Prisma, which is the same thing that we'd pass when we're just using Apollo server here. So now our schema link is going to connect to our schema directly, and it's going to have this as a context. If you know, this type right here is a lot different than this type here, or it's declared over here in our context. This type is a micro request, but this type is not. So we can actually go here and declare that this is a next. Let me get the type of this. It's incoming message. It's this right here. So I'll just paste it in here. And import that. Okay, so now we can go back here and continue what we're doing. So here we'll do await Apollo client dot query, and we would just run any query that we want to run. So I'm going to write a query here called test query is equal to GQL, and then here I'll write the query, which is just test bool to true. So here we'll pass in test query, pretty sure we need to write it like that. Okay, so now we're running a query and the result is getting cached in our Apollo client, because I'm sure you're aware every query we do gets cached automatically in Apollo client. So then here we would do return add Apollo state. We pass in our client and we pass in page props, which was an object with the props property. We can have it empty. So now let me explain to you what we have just done with all of this setup and all of this code. So on the server, we run initialize Apollo and we pass in our context. So over here, we initialize Apollo and we have a context. Then we have this temporary variable and we set it to either our global instance of Apollo client up here, which is initialized to null. And if that's null, we just set the temporary variable to a new instance of Apollo client. If we were passing initial state, then we merge our existing cache with the state or cache that was passed into this function. We see that in action right here. When we use the use Apollo hook, we pass in page props. Page props is equal to whatever we return from here, and I'll get to that now. So when we use the use Apollo hook, we're also doing something very similar. We're initializing Apollo with an initial state, and it's running this, and it's merging the initial state with whatever state was already existing in our Apollo client. So you see that this is code that works for the client and the server. So we have this temporary variable and it's all good. Once we're done merging, if we need to, we just set our cache to that merged cache. And if we're on the server, we just return the temporary variable. And we never set the global variable to anything, so it stays null. That way, every time we run this function, we always create a new instance when we're on the server. This is so that two requests don't conflict, or their caches don't conflict with each other. But if we're not on the server, we skip this and we set our global variable to our instance. That way, every time we initialize Apollo again, we actually don't initialize anything and we just grab our global variable. This happens so that on the client, we only have one active instance of Apollo client at any moment in time. And the thing is that every time we change page props, we call this again. And so here in add Apollo state, this is the function that we use on the server. It takes in our client and page props, as you see here when we're doing server-side rendering. So we pass in our client and this object right here. So what this does is it gets the client here, it extracts the cache and adds it to page props. And so now we're returning props to our front-end component that has our Apollo cache. So now when we're over here, when we run on the front end, every component runs under this right here. And this gets the page props and merges it into our Apollo client's cache on the front end. So we're getting the data from the back end, merging it with our existing data using the use Apollo hook. So now when we're on the front end, we don't have to make a request to get that data. We already have it passed to us. Let me show you an example. So here we can do const and get loading and data from use query, and we pass in our test query. Let's also tell Apollo to notify us. Well, first we have to import use query, and I imported the wrong thing. So let me import it from Apollo client, and we'll tell Apollo to notify us on any network change, which re-renders the component whenever our network connection changes. So now the interesting thing about this is that we already have the data from our backend in our Apollo client. So this query never goes through our network. Its result is already cached. So Apollo client just accesses the cache and immediately has the data. Loading is never true. It's always false. Of course, we can always refetch the data and we'll do client-side rendering. But how we have things now, this is the way that we're doing server-side rendering using Apollo. And I'll just prove it to you that we're actually not doing any network request. That this data here is going to be part of our HTML when we receive HTML from the server. This is getting rendered on the server. So here, let me show it to you. So I'm going to put a div here, a div, and I'll just render the data, and I'll do JSON.stringify on the data, like so. This is never going to give me an error because we're never loading, we're never doing any requests. We always have the data from this page. When it gets rendered into HTML, the data is already included into it. And I'll also prove it to you by doing if loading console log, console log had to load, and then here I'll do server equals, and then I'll do type of window is equal to undefined. And if we're not loading, so if this component renders and we're not loading, I'll do not loading. So let me just prove this to you real quick. So now if everything worked fine, we can just run our server. And let me make sure that I have a Prisma running. Okay, so I'm just gonna run the server and navigate over to it. Okay, so we have an error and we see here that context was not passed in. So simply we can just get rid of this because I realized that we're getting an error because we're actually running this function on the server when we're rendering our page into HTML. So that's not a problem, don't worry about that. But if you check on the console, it says not loading, server's true. So there's never a moment where we actually console log had to load, and this is on the server. So this runs here when we're doing server-side rendering, when we're putting it to HTML. So we never had to console log this. So this was always available. And here, let me change this to .test. Okay, so here is true. Let me show you some further proof. Check it out here on the network tab. I'm gonna throttle my network to be very slow. So I'm gonna put it to slow 3G. And I'm gonna get rid of all of this server-side rendering thing that we got going on. And I'm gonna show you how it is by default in client-side rendering. So I'm just gonna comment everything out. Like that, okay? So I'm gonna refresh this page. And you see here it says had to load, right? Because when our page was rendered on the server, the data was not available. So it had to console log this. And here's probably like rendering undefined or something, or just nothing. So now I'm just waiting for the page to finish downloading onto my browser. And if you notice, our page is loaded, but that text took a while to show up. And if you look in the request here, we have a request to our API/GraphQL, which happened over here in our component when we sent a query. Now let me just get rid of that throttle to offline, or not offline, to no throttling, and introduce back server-side rendering and how we had everything set up. Okay, so I'm gonna refresh the page again. And notice how it said here, had to load, right? Let's do it again. Not loading. And here there's no GraphQL request, and here it showed up immediately. If you check the console as well, it never had to load. It already had it in the cache. So yeah, that's how we're gonna use Apollo Client to do server-side rendering. So let me just get rid of all of this. The only downside to this is that right now our data is a type of any. So we're not getting any autocomplete here or any assurance on what we're doing is right. We could basically misspell this to people or something, and nothing ever shows up, and we really don't know what's going on. There's no errors. We're just lost, right? So what's the point of TypeScript? Well, in the next video, I'm going to show you how to get types working on your queries with Apollo Client. So everything is type safe, and it's a really easy thing, and it will just make all of this so much better. So yeah, hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll catch you in the next one.